doing business admits of several ethical levels. Let me suggest 4. The first level might be called the intrapersonal. It may be counterintuitive, but I want to stress that from a Christian perspective, doing business in a global economy is very much a matter of an individual's interior life. In The Merchant of Venice, this is nicely illustrated by the somewhat comical but nonetheless serious moral struggle of the clown Lancelot, trying to decide whether or not to abandon one employer, Shylock, and to seek out another. Back and forth he goes between his conscience, which tells him to stay, and the fiend, which tells him to leave. Budge, says the fiend. Budge not, says my conscience. He finally listens to the fiend and leaves Shylock's service. Now certainly Lancelot is not the only character to undergo internal struggle. Other characters surely engage in inner dialogues as well. But the point is, we should not let a focus on the macro, global economy eclipse the micro level, the micro world of personal interiority. There is perhaps no Christian theologian writing today who is more cognizant of global realities and the need for a global ethic than the Swiss theologian Hans Küng. Yet Küng says that, quote, despite all the consequences for specific areas, an ethic is primarily concerned with the inner realm of a person, the sphere of the conscience, of the heart, which is not directly exposed to sanctions that can be imposed by political power. And we might consider economic power as well. Or consider what the Catholic bishops of the world said at the Second Vatican Council, which met about 50 years ago. In a very important document entitled The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, they said this: for man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His dignity lies in observing this law, and by it he will be judged. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There alone he is with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. By conscience, in a wonderful way, that law is made known, which is fulfilled in the love of God and one's neighbor. According to this view, every person engaged in business, of whatever religion or no religion, is in the depths of his or her being in conversation with the divine. The second level we might call the interpersonal. And in The Merchant of Venice, interpersonal relations abound. Antonio and Shylock, Shylock and his daughter, who elopes with a Christian but not before robbing her father of his jewels. Antonio and his friend Bassanio, for whom Antonio risks his life. Portia and her various suitors from around the world, each of whom she finds wanting, except for Bassanio, and so on and so on. Each of these interpersonal relationships deserves comment. But my only comment here is that the interpersonal relationships and the quality of those relationships in the workplace and beyond are central and critical to business on any scale. And of course, the Christian tradition, as the Islamic tradition, has much to say about such relationships, beginning perhaps with the golden rule, love thy neighbor as thyself. A third level might be termed intergroup. Not just Antonio and Shylock's mutual antagonism on a personal level, but the anti-Semitism in which Shakespeare himself may or may not be fully implicated. This poisonous relationship cannot and should not be ignored. But in terms of the play, we might also consider the possibly complex and mixed relations between and among peoples and ethnicities and nations and cultures that international trading entails. Remember Antonio's ships spread out across the globe, including encounters with groups of pirates, no small issue today in the global economy. And the fact is, Christianity has had many different things to say about diversity of this kind, leading to differing perspectives on business in the global economy. A fourth related level might be called the structural or legal. As Antonio waits in jail for the case against him to be heard, Antonio's companion Salanio tells him not to worry. He says, I'm sure the Duke of Venice will never grant this forfeiture to hold. But Antonio replies, the Duke cannot deny the course of law. For the commodity that strangers have with us in Venice, if it be denied, will much impeach the justice of the state, since that trade and profit of the city consisteth of all nations. In other words, if this contract is not upheld, no one will do business with Venice, and its economy, which is tied into the world economy, will crumble. This situation raises a host of questions about legal structures, contracts, international treaties, making them and breaking them, and so on. My point is not to discuss any of these things, but simply to say that from a Christian perspective or perspectives, this level also matters. And many Christian thinkers have had many things and sometimes conflicting things to say about law. Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, Francisco de Vitoria, a Dominican, and many others, up to a recent speaker down at the Priory at the Siena Center, Kathleen Caveney, a theologian and a lawyer from Notre Dame, who a few days later after she spoke here was a guest on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. Certainly a first for Dominican. So, this single court case is decisive for Venice and its place in the global economy and international trade. But there is more. There is at issue yet another level, a level quite distinct from, yet related to an earthly exchange of goods and services, a level that Wendell Berry calls the great economy. Let us call this the transcendental or theological level. When Portia gives her famous speech about mercy and pleads with Shylock to be merciful, she makes a theological argument. Mercy droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven, she says. Mercy is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute of God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jude, though justice be thy pleas, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. Let me rephrase Portia's argument. If this evening we are discussing Christian and Muslim perspectives on doing business, for example, banking, and if, according to the Bible, a Christian is to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, and if God is merciful, then if you are a true Christian in your banking practices, you should be merciful. None of this foreclosure stuff we read about in the papers or experience perhaps in our own families or friends. In short, the world economy should match the heavenly economy. Mercy, not justice, should be the rule. But as the Duke of Venice and even Antonio himself recognized, we can't just forget about justice. For example, the debts must be repaid and failure results in penalty. That would be a disaster for the economy. Free riders, deadbeat dads, Greece simply defaulting on its loans, all that sort of thing. And it turns out the Duke's dilemma, I'd like to dismiss this case, but I can't, may even be God's dilemma too. At least it seems to me that is how one great Christian theologian back in the 11th century saw things. For St. Anselm of Canterbury, in Adam and Eve, the whole human race has sinned against God and has thus dug itself into a hole from which it cannot extricate itself. No one gets off the hook.